Good morning. This is Reverend Benjamin Pettit, and I am here today, and I'm going to interview Dr. Randy Maddox about what I would call shady evidence about some particular points of trying to prove where John Wesley stood on end times, particularly that he was supposedly a postmillennialist. And the founder of the postmillennial theory is Daniel Whitby. And he lived from 1638 to 1726, and so it's a recent theory. You know, it's not been there church age long. It doesn't go back to the disciples and the early apostles and what Jesus taught. It's not found in the New Testament. There's no passage of Scripture that defends postmillennialism, I would say, and so trying to put the founder of Methodism in that camp. It, to me, is like putting a puzzle piece in history in the wrong place. It just doesn't work. And so I'm here to ask in this interview some questions, direct questions, pointed questions that I think are loaded to try to expose the fact that this is a false interpretation of John Wesley and his view of end times. Okay, so Dr. Maddox, please show me that John Wesley, for a fact, either quoted Whitby directly, or we can prove from evidence from his libraries that he had Whitby in his libraries, or whatever evidence you have. I want you to prove it to me that John Wesley, number one, read Whitby, number two, followed him in his eschatological view called postmillennialism. Okay, so let's at least show the direct connection between John Wesley and Daniel Whitby, okay, or his works. Please do that for me right now. Well, Benjamin, to answer your question, the evidence is plentiful. But in order to narrow it down a bit so that we can discuss this in an intelligent way, I would begin by referencing, as I have in my works, a letter that Wesley wrote to a man named Richard Locke in September of 1770. Okay, and so this was a work that I did for a few years back. My source is called John Wesley's Reading. Okay, so this is kind of his source list of reading. Evidence in the book collection at Wesley House, London. Okay, so I went through his Wesley library, okay, and I wanted to see if there was a Daniel Whitby book in the library, okay, and there was, okay. The particular work that was there was written by Daniel Whitby in 1727. It's called A Paraphrase and Commentary on the New Testament. It's the 5th edition. It was printed in London, and it's only one volume. Okay, so maybe that is what you're asking me. Well, to continue this interview, I hear your answer, okay, Dr. Maddox, but I think maybe we should back up a second. Let me explain a little bit who Daniel Whitby was, at least in brief. He was an Anglican priest, so we know he was out of the same church John Wesley came out of. He was in the same place, Church of England, and that he defended Arminian theology at some points in his writing career. But he was a very voluminous writer, okay? But before he died, he showed himself to be a heretic. Not only would I classify him that for his view called postmillennialism, which I believe hurt the church, but he held Unitarian views of God, which are false, okay? And, so his writings have been classified as out of line with traditional Arminian thinking on original sin, for instance, okay? And so definitely not somebody that Wesley would follow just for that presentation alone. Because we all know Wesley very strongly said that so far as you've allow original sin, you are a Christian. Okay, he wrote that in his writings. And so I highly doubt that he would just follow somebody of that caliber, as far as being in heresy, to teach people about end times. All right. So we are aware he read Whitby at some point in his life, like you referenced. And it is brought up in that letter. Okay. So let's take a look at that letter. It says, to Richard Locke, and Locke's was the surveyor of the parish of Burnham, which lies among the sandhills between Bristol and Weston-super-Mare. All right, so he was a person there. September 14th, 1770. Okay, so this is after John Wesley wrote his New Testament notes, which were in the 1750s, 1754, okay? And this is what he wrote. Milton justly supposes that if ever angelic minds reasoned on, quote, free will entire, foreknowledge absolute, they would find no end in wandering mazes lost. How much less can a human mind reconcile them? Men have no line to fathom such a depth. We may, however, rest in this. Yet my foreknowledge causes not their fault, which had no less been certain unforeknown. I believe you will find some light on the heads. Now Wesley's giving him some direction about this issue of foreknowledge, and predestination obviously is the subject matter here. I believe you'll find some light on the head by reading that predestination calmly considered, which he wrote. Okay, John Wesley wrote. The illustrators, Mr. Harwood, Leibniz, Clark, Montesquieu, and above all, that wretched man Voltaire. So he just brought up a whole bunch of people who are out of line, okay, with Christianity, would only unhinge and perplex your mind. So he's saying don't go into that kind of reading that'll hurt you. And he says Hall, Scott, Sharp, and then the name Whitby appears right there. Whitby and Fleetwood are good writers. So are Locke, Hooper, and Mosham in their several ways, but far less useful than Baxter and Law. All right, Dr. South, Knight, and Taylor are some of the finest writers in the English tongue, if you mean Dr. James Knight of St. Sepulchre's. Okay, and then he says, but I believe the best way for you would be to read only a few select authors. Then, mixing reading with prayer, you would not only find good desires, but they would be brought to good effect. I am your servant for Christ's sake. To Mr. Richard Locke at Burnham near Bridgewater, footnotes say some other things about it, but it's obviously the subject matter's predestination, all right? And so he didn't reference anything about end times. It has the last name Whitby, and it's clearly saying that that they have some good, but it's limited. And he's only talking about, like what we mentioned earlier, that at one point this man's writings were used for a defense of Arminianism, which is what he's saying to use it for here. He's not talking about end times at all. There's no reference to eschatology in this letter at all. Would you agree with that? And then as we continue with the interview, I want to show you further something that you've written in this same book that we discussed that you wrote. John Wesley's Reading Evidence in the Book Collection at Wesley's House, London. All right, so I want you to briefly discuss with me what you've written there about how the collection was transferred at one point, and how you've had to classify works as very definitely Wesley's. They have things inside of them that prove they were Wesley's works, his markings, his handwriting, his signature, all those things. And tell me kind of what happened to this library throughout the history after John Wesley. And then I want to bring some further questions to you, okay? Would you please do that? Thank you. Yes, no problem. I will explain the history of his personal library. We know that the collection at one point was transferred, probably by Thomas Jackson, one of the ones that was involved in an edition of his works later on. But it was transferred nonetheless to Richmond College, sometime in the 1800s, so after John Wesley passed away. And then later returned 172 years later to the City Road Chapel in 1972. So there's reasons for that. They were, making it more of a historical landmark. So we know it was transferred. And there were books in the collection when it returned that post-date Wesley. Okay. These he may have owned or read. So that's kind of my classification in the writing. May have owned or read. Now, you're probably going to ask me, I'm assuming, because you said there's going to be questions in this area. Was this in the highest group of evidence that John Wesley owned this book, that it wasn't a later book put into the collection and then brought back accidentally? No, it is not. There are books that clearly have his signature and his hand-marked writings that he would do in the works, and this is not one of those. It's listed in Maddox's my second section, in my work. Works with, and I classify them this way: works with no signature, but other evidence that Wesley knew. Okay, and so I've already covered with you the other evidence that Wesley knew about the work, because he referenced in 1770 that he had told his friend that he should read Whitby, and so telling us that he had read Whitby at some point in his career. All right, so yeah, it's not absolutely confirmed. It could be a book that was brought into the collection later, because it doesn't have his signature, it doesn't have his writing in it, and all his works that we have that we are absolutely certain about do. And so it could have been brought into the collection as it sat there 172 years in another locale, and then was brought back as one of those books that post-date Wesley. That's just a fact. I hope that helps you, because I know that's probably where you're going with your line of questioning. There you go. I thank you for your honesty about these things. It's important to present them as clear as we can to, so people can make their decision. This is a vital piece of evidence. If Wesley never, in fact, read Whitby or owned a copy of his works, and this was something later put into his library, that's a problem. And if that letter was not making a reference to eschatology, but maybe one of his other writings, I could definitely suggest what one that one was. We know that he wrote in 1691 a Latin tract on the divinity of Christ. It sounds very much here like what is being referenced could be that, because there is Socinian controversy taking place at that time. Calvinists found themselves in that. Fletcher had to debate them on that point. And but so this sounds more like it was subjects about predestination and the divinity of Christ that he could be referencing here, because the particular context that Wesley puts on it, where he's saying, don't go into Voltaire and all these that would come against, the divinity and so forth, but instead you need to, check out some of these sources that try to, at points, defend those aspects. So again, there's no, so basically what I feel from this interview is that there's no direct evidence whatsoever that Wesley owned Whitby's works, that we can absolutely nail, and that he read them, except this particular work on the divinity of Christ in 1691, and nothing about eschatology, and what's absolutely remarkable to me is that when I was looking at this subject, I had to figure, well, these scholars are going to take me right to the New Testament notes and show me where Wesley referenced Whitby's name, and they can't. This is it. And so I think we need to rethink some things. Puts a lot of trouble to trying to even prove that Wesley was associating himself with the stands of Whitby at all, especially about eschatology. Thank you.